I was recently diving into the grim records of the Qing dynasty, and one image stuck with me. A man standing at the city gates, his face freshly tattooed with blue-black ink and his neck locked in a 35-kilogram wooden collar. He wasn't being led to an executioner. He was being sent to the great northern wilderness. To his family watching from the walls, he was already a ghost. This was Lufeng exile. It wasn't just a relocation. It was a social death. In a culture built entirely on family webs, the state realized the most brutal thing they could do wasn't killing you. It was moving you so far away that you ceased to exist. For 1,000 years, China used its own geography as a weapon to break the human spirit. I used to think about this history when looking at modern China's obsession with infrastructure. To be honest, I viewed the sprawling high-speed rail network as a bit of a white elephant, a fiscal black hole that defied economic logic. Why spend trillions connecting remote, impoverished mountains to the glittering hubs of Chengdu or Beijing? From a purely data-driven perspective, it looked like an irrational obsession with concrete and steel. But then I came across a story from a young media professional in Chengdu. He grew up in a Guizhou village, so isolated it once required a 3-day trek through raw mountain trails just to reach civilization. He's a gay man living a modern, urban life that his traditional village could never truly contain. In any other era of Chinese history, he would be a modern exile, forced to choose between dying to his family to be himself or dying to himself to stay with his family. Instead, he posted a photo from a train window. Because of that fiscally irrational rail line, he can work in a high-tech metropolis and still be at his parents' dinner table in a few hours. That shift in perspective, from seeing a train as a debt trap to seeing it as the surgical cure for social death, is what we're really talking about today. We're exploring how the very mountains that once served as natural prison walls are being turned into gateways, and how a nation is trying to use speed to outrun the ancient curse of distance.
Wow. That is, it's a really profound way to frame it because, we are so incredibly used to analyzing these massive infrastructure projects purely through the lens of a balance sheet.
Right. It's always about the dollars and cents.
Exactly. We sit there and ask, does the ticket revenue cover the electricity bill this quarter? Or does the upfront construction cost justify the marginal GDP bump in the region? But when you frame it through that historical lens of Lufeng, of that forced exile, you realize we are actually dealing with something much more primal.
It's not just moving trains.
No, it's the literal compression of space and time in a way that fundamentally alters the human experience for an entire population.
I totally agree with the poetry of that, and I want to push back on this just a little bit right out of the gate. While the idea of curing exile is a beautiful narrative, we're still talking about trillions of dollars being poured into concrete and steel. So my question is this narrative of connecting hearts just a really nice cover story for what might secretly be a massive economic miscalculation? I mean, you look at the map and they're punching enormous tunnels through mountains where historically nobody really went unless they absolutely had to. Is the economic math actually there?
Is it? And to really answer it, we have to look past the surface-level white elephant headlines. If you just look at the raw debt carried by the state railway operator in isolation, yeah, it looks a bit scary.
Looks like a huge red flag.
But if you look at the systemic impact, how it reshapes the entire board, the story changes completely. We need to talk about what I call the economic catalyst effect. And I think the best way to do this isn't in the abstract. Let's actually go right back to that region you mentioned in the intro, Guizhou.
Okay, the home province of that young man.
Yes. But let's look at a completely different demographic. Let's look at a woman named Lin. She lives right in the heart of those karst mountains.
And for anyone who hasn't seen photos of Guizhou, the geography there is just, it's wild.
It is visually spectacular. You have these endless, jagged limestone peaks, incredibly deep valleys, sheer cliffs. It's exactly the kind of place that looks phenomenal on a tourist postcard, but is an absolute sheer nightmare for logistics.
A natural cage, essentially.
And for centuries, those mountains totally dictated the economic reality of the people living there. Lin lives in a village that was defined by what sociologists call relational self-isolation.
Relational self-isolation.
It's essentially an academic way of saying that your entire universe, your economic opportunities, your marriage prospects, your social standing, your worldview, were all strictly confined to the people who lived within walking distance of your front door.
Which perfectly ties back to that concept of social death. If you literally cannot move, you cannot grow. Yeah. You're just geographically locked.
Right. Lin told this incredible story about her grandfather. In his day, if they wanted to sell something as simple as a basket of tea, just a basic agricultural commodity, it required a grueling 3-day trek through narrow, dangerous mountain trails just to reach the absolute closest market town.
3 days just to get to the market.
3 days of walking. Think about the massive economic friction there. You're spending 3 days of hard physical labor just to get your product to a place where you even have the chance to sell it. It's not just inefficient, it's prohibitive.
Yeah, you just wouldn't do it.
Exactly. It means you don't even bother. You stay poor because the baseline cost of participating in the broader economy is actually higher than the profit you'd make from the tea.
It's like the hungry ghost syndrome.
Yeah.
You are technically a citizen of this massive growing country, but you're completely starved of any real connection to it.
But now look at the physical reality on the ground today. I saw this documentary footage where Lynn is standing on a platform, and it's not a dirt track anymore. It is a gleaming, ultra-modern, silver bullet train station that has been literally carved directly into the side of the limestone mountain.
Carved into the mountain.
It looks like a piece of science fiction architecture just dropped straight into a medieval landscape.
That's an amazing visual. But I assume the train isn't just there for the locals to take sightseeing trips.
Definitely not. Lynn runs a small business selling traditional embroidery. It's a highly specialized craft that has been passed down in her specific village for generations. Before the train, that embroidery essentially never left the village. Maybe once in a while, a few determined backpackers would hike in and buy a piece. Now she literally just hops on that high-speed train. She can personally transport her delicate inventory directly to high-end boutiques in megacities like Shanghai or Hangzhou in just a matter of hours.
Okay, that is a fantastic story, but let me put my skeptical hat back on.
I expected nothing less.
One woman selling beautiful embroidery to boutiques in Shanghai is a heartwarming anecdote. It's a great human interest piece. But does that alone justify a multi-billion-dollar bridge and tunnel network? I mean, are we just scaling up a nice anecdote into a national economic strategy, or is there hard macro-level data that proves this actually works?
That is totally fair, and that is exactly where we have to introduce the core economic concept of agglomeration. This is the massive invisible engine that actually justifies the upfront cost. Agglomeration isn't just about moving physical goods faster, it's about radically increasing the economic mass of a region.
Economic mass. Okay, I need you to explain that. Because when I hear mass, I just think of physical size. Are we just saying that train makes cities geographically bigger?
Not physically bigger, no. Think of it like gravity. In physics, the larger the mass of an object, the stronger its gravitational pull. In economics, the more people, the more businesses, the more specialized talent, and the more ideas you can seamlessly cram into a reachable, practical area, the exponentially more productive everyone in that area becomes.
When you build a high-speed line between two cities, say, cutting the travel time from an agonizing 4 hours down to a smooth 1 hour. You haven't actually moved any buildings, but you have effectively, practically merged their labor and consumer markets into one single ecosystem.
So a medium-sized company in the smaller city can now realistically hire a senior engineer who lives in the big megacity because the engineer doesn't actually have to uproot their family and move.
Exactly. They can commute or consult easily. And it goes so much deeper than just hiring. It fundamentally rewires supply chains.
I was looking at some deep dive data from the World Bank that specifically analyzed this effect in China. They found that having the economic distance, which is their metric for travel time and friction between two areas, can lead to a 10% rise in average business productivity.
10%?
Yes.
That seems incredibly high. I mean, usually when you talk about infrastructure upgrades like adding a highway lane, you're fighting for efficiency gains in the 1 or 2% range. 10% is massive.
Massive. And here is exactly why it happens. It allows for hyperspecialization. Think about a factory located in a secondary place like the zoo. Without the fast train connection, that factory essentially has to do everything entirely in-house.
Because they're isolated.
Right. They need to keep their own mediocre legal team on retainer, their own marketing department, their own specialized machinery repair crew on payroll. Why? Because they literally cannot rely on outside help arriving in time to fix a crisis.
It takes too long to get there.
Exactly. But the very second that high-speed train connects them seamlessly to Beijing or Tianjin, they can completely outsource all those peripheral functions. They can hire the absolute best corporate lawyers in Beijing, have them come down for an emergency morning meeting, and those lawyers are back in their Beijing office by lunch.
Wow.
If a machine breaks down, they don't need a guy on staff. They can get a highly specialized repair technician from the city on site in 90 minutes.
So the local factory can stop trying to be a jack of all trades, which they are probably bad at, and just focus 100% of their capital on what they actually manufacture.
Correct. It allows the smaller regional city to physically and economically plug right into the brain and the muscle of the megacity. And we see this bearing out in the hard data. Second and third tier cities like Jinan, Jilin, and Dezhou are seeing annual GDP boosts of between 0.55% and 1% that are solely directly attributable to the rail connection.
Just from being plugged into the network.
Just from the connection. And remember, that is compound annual growth. Over a 10-year horizon, that is a staggering amount of wealth creation.
Okay, I'm tracking with you on the manufacturing and the corporate business side, but I know another huge piece of this puzzle is culture and tourism. I feel like tourism is constantly touted by local politicians as the ultimate savior of remote regions, but it often ends up being a bit of a mirage, like build it and they will come. Doesn't always work out.
It definitely can be a mirage in a lot of cases, but in the specific context of high-speed rail in China, the sheer overwhelming volume of passengers creates a totally different reality. For example, Corfu.
Corfu, that's Confucius's hometown, right?
Exactly. Historically speaking, Corfu was always a major cultural pilgrimage site, but logistically, it was an absolute pain to get to.
Imagine.
If you wanted to go, you were looking at booking an overnight train from Beijing that took somewhere between 7 to 10 hours. And it wasn't a convenient schedule. They would often unceremoniously drop you off at the station at 4 in the morning.
Brutal.
Or you had to take a long, rattling, uncomfortable bus ride over winding roads. So because of that friction, the city was realistically accessible only to the very determined.
Like hardcore history scholars or deeply religious folks.
Right. The average person looking for a fun weekend trip would absolutely skip it for something way easier. Corfu was treated like a remote, dusty relic.
So how did the rail change the math there?
Enter the high-speed rail. They open Corfu East Station. Almost overnight, that grueling 8-hour ordeal transforms into a totally effortless 2-hour breeze.
2 hours.
2 hours. You can casually leave Beijing at 8 in the morning, comfortably walk the grounds of the Kong family mansion, have a fantastic local lunch, and easily be back in your Beijing apartment in time for dinner.
You don't even need to pack a bag.
Exactly. The rail didn't just capture existing tourists, it created an entirely new market category out of thin air. The cultural weekend break.
So it takes this piece of ancient culture and shifts it from a dry chapter in a history book into an accessible part of modern lifestyle.
And the numbers absolutely back up that shift. Corfu East Station handles millions of passengers now. The local tourism revenue jumps significantly. The data estimates put a 10% increase in total tourism revenue squarely and directly on the shoulders of the high-speed rail. It transforms these heritage sites into vibrant living classrooms and massively injects capital into the local service economy.
But, and here's where I have to bring the skepticism back again, it cannot possibly be all upsides for everyone. I was reading through some of the research, specifically an incredible paper analyzing county-level economic impacts, and it heavily discussed something called the siphoning effect. And the way they described it, it sounded a lot like the straw theory I've heard debated in Western urban planning circles.
It is exactly the same concept, and you are totally right to bring this up because this is the stark reality that often gets conveniently glossed over in the glossy promotional brochures. The siphoning effect is the undeniable dark side of hyperconnectivity. The theory is incredibly simple. If you connect a tiny, quiet pond to a massive ocean with a really wide pipe, the ocean doesn't necessarily flow in and fill up the pond.
Right, sometimes the ocean just aggressively drains the pond. Because if I'm a shopper living in a small, quiet town, and suddenly a super fast train makes it incredibly easy and cheap to pop over to the massive metropolis down the line, why on earth would I buy my clothes at the local limited general store? I'm just going to save my money and go to the big city where the selection is infinitely better.
And the terrifying part for local leaders is that it's not just shoppers taking the train out, it's talent, it's investment capital. The study found a really fascinating divergence. They saw that urban districts that got stations experienced an absolute boom, and even rural counties that directly got stations saw notable growth in certain sectors. But the counties that were merely adjacent to the stations, or the ones that the rail line bypassed completely, very often saw their local service sectors actively contract and shrink.
Wow. So they get to listen to the noise of the train whistling past, but they don't get a single drop of the economic benefit.
Or worse, the train actually just acts as a fast track for their best, brightest, and most ambitious young people to pack up and leave for good. We frame this as the amplifying role of infrastructure. A train line is an amplifier of whatever economic reality is already on the ground.
So it doesn't create wealth magically.
No. If a city already has strong underlying potential, the train uncorks it and lets it explode. But if a city's economy is fundamentally weak or uncompetitive, the train might just rapidly speed up its inevitable decline by drastically lowering the barrier to exit.
That makes perfect sense. So linking this back to our earlier stories, Lynn's village thrives because she has a highly specific, unique product, that traditional embroidery, that the big wealthy city desperately wants but can't produce itself. But if her village only had a completely generic convenience store, she might actually go out of business because everyone would just take the train to shop at the massive supermall in the city.
That is an incredibly astute distinction. The train viciously punishes mediocrity, but heavily rewards differentiation. If a region has something inherently unique to offer, whether that is stunning ecotourism, a highly specialized local craft, or specific natural resources, they win big. If they're just providing generic, easily replaceable services, they are going to get absolutely crushed by the overwhelming competition from the mega city.
So as a government, how do you even begin to manage that dynamic? Because politically and socially, you can't just throw your hands up and let half the country wither away into ghost towns while the coast booms into the stratosphere.
You absolutely cannot. And that is exactly where targeted, nuanced policy has to step in. The sources emphasize the critical need for regionally differentiated policies. It can't be one size fits all. Well, in the heavily developed east places like the Yangtze River Delta, where the economy is already super mature, the government policy focuses heavily on pushing industrial upgrading. They want those connected cities focusing on high-tech manufacturing and advanced financial services.
Right.
But in the West, in rugged places like Yuzhou, the state knows they can't just blast a train tunnel through a mountain, cut a ribbon, and walk away. That would be disastrous. They absolutely have to simultaneously invest heavily in what urban planners call the capillaries.
The capillaries. So the train is the main artery.
Exactly. You build the high-speed artery, but then you also have to pave the local feeder roads. You have to lay down high-speed fiber optic internet in the villages. You have to fund local vocational training centers. You have to actively build the capacity of those remote regions so they can actually produce something of value to feed into the network, rather than just being helplessly drained by it.
It's an incredibly delicate balancing act. It sounds like the high-speed train is essentially just a massive power tool. And like any power tool, you can use it to build a beautiful house, or you can accidentally cut off your own hand, depending entirely on how carefully you use it.
That is a very vivid image, but perfectly accurate.
I want to completely pivot our focus now. We've talked a lot about the money, the supply chains, the factories, the tourists. That is all the hard, cold infrastructure, the hardware of the nation. But the second segment of our deep dive is focused on social cohesion. And I genuinely think this is where the software of the country comes into play. This is where we circle back to that really compelling idea of the relational self.
Yes. This is exactly where the narrative moves out of the sterile spreadsheet and directly into people's living rooms.
And to anchor this, we have the story of Zhao. I think Zhao's personal situation is one that millions and millions of people can deeply relate to, not just within China, but honestly anywhere in the world that has a massive, stark, urban-rural economic divide. Zhao works as a mid-level tech employee in Shenzhen.
Right. And Shenzhen, for context, is basically the Silicon Valley of hardware. The pace of life there is unimaginably fast, it is phenomenally expensive, and the work culture is incredibly intense.
Right. But Zhao isn't from there. He is originally from a much quieter, rural part of Hunan province. Now, under the old traditional model of China's massive economic rise over the last 40 years, Zhao would have just been another statistic in the floating population. He would move to Shenzhen, live in a cramped, noisy factory dormitory or a tiny shared apartment. He would grind away at the notorious 996 schedule, working from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 full days a week. And maybe, just maybe, if he was extremely lucky and could get a ticket, he would see his parents exactly once a year during the chaotic Spring Festival rush.
And that brutal reality was widely accepted as the standard, unavoidable price of rapid modernization. You explicitly traded your personal family life for your family's economic advancement. But the toll that took was immense. It caused a massive, deep social fracture across the entire country. You ended up with a whole tragic generation of left-behind children growing up without parents and isolated, lonely, elderly parents aging without their kids.
Because the distance was just too great.
The physical distance translated into emotional distance. The core Confucian ideal of filial piety, of physically being present to respect and care for your elders, didn't just become difficult. Under that old logistical model, it was structurally impossible for a migrant worker.
But Zhao's life today looks entirely different. He's essentially hacking the system. He recently shared a vlog detailing his exact routine, and it's fascinating. Every other Friday, he physically clocks out of his tech job in Shenzhen, walks to the station, hops on a sleek high-speed train, and travels 800 kilometers.
800 kilometers. We really need to pause and put that specific distance into perspective for a second. That is roughly the equivalent distance from London all the way up to Aberdeen in Scotland, or driving from San Diego all the way up to San Francisco.
It's a massive distance, and he completes that journey in under 4 hours. He literally gets home to his rural village in time to sit down for a late Friday night dinner with his aging parents. He spends his entire Saturday doing things like physically maintaining the family grave sites, which, as we know from the cultural context, is an absolutely non-negotiable, sacred duty in many parts of the country.
It is the ultimate expression of the relational self.
Exactly. He hangs out, he genuinely reconnects with his roots, and then Sunday evening, he boards the train and zooms right back to the cutting edge of the future in Shenzhen. He explicitly refers to this bi-weekly routine as his social resurrection.
I absolutely love that term, social resurrection. It directly implies that without this physical high-speed connection, he deeply feels that he is, in some very real way, socially dead.
And the primary sources we analyzed, specifically an excellent piece of sociological research from the Kent Academic Repository, actually discuss this exact modern phenomenon through a theoretical framework called motility. Now, I consider myself pretty well read, and I know what mobility means. It means moving. What on earth is motility?
It's a really fascinating, nuanced distinction in the sociology of transport. Mobility is strictly the physical act of moving. I went from point A to point B. It's a description of an event. Motility, on the other hand, is the underlying potential to move. It is your inherent capacity and freedom to be mobile. And the researchers break motility down into 3 very distinct, necessary elements: access, competence, and appropriation.
Okay, let's break those 3 down because I want to make sure I fully grasp this. Access seems pretty straightforward. Is there physically a train station near me?
Right. That's the hardware layer. Access is simply, does the high-speed train exist? Does it go where I need it to go? And importantly, can I financially afford to buy the ticket? If the answer is yes, you have access. But competence is the crucial second layer. Do you actually know how to seamlessly navigate this massive, complex system?
Like, can I use the smartphone app to book a ticket?
Exactly. Can you use the apps? Do you intuitively understand the intricate timetables? Do you know how to navigate a massive transit hub that has 500,000 people in it without having a panic attack? And then the third element, appropriation, is frankly the most interesting one of all.
Appropriation. Usually that word has negative connotations.
In this context, it just means how you personally internalize and integrate that potential movement into your core identity and your long-term life strategy.
Okay, so applying that to our guy Zhao, he has fully appropriated the train system. He doesn't just look at it as a big metal tube that goes fast. He actively uses it as the foundational glue holding his 2 completely disparate lives together.
Exactly. He has successfully constructed what sociologists are now calling a dual location household. He completely refuses to be categorized. He isn't fully an urban tech bro, and he isn't fully a rural village son. He is actively inhabiting the high-speed corridor between those 2 identities. And the extensive research on the Yangtze River Delta, specifically looking at the incredibly busy Suzhou to Shanghai line, shows that Zhao is definitely not alone in this. There are literally entire distinct tribes of these hypercommuters now.
The outline specifically uses that word, tribes. Who exactly are these tribes?
Well, on one extreme end of the spectrum, you have the daily commuter. These are the absolute extreme hardcore users of the system.
Okay.
They are usually professionals who work in downtown Shanghai where the corporate salaries are astronomically high. But they deliberately choose to live in Suzhou, a separate city, because the residential apartments are significantly larger, the schools might be less cutthroat, and the air is just cleaner. And they do this massive intercity round trip every single day.
Every single day. Honestly, that sounds completely exhausting. I mean, even if the train is going 300 kilometers an hour, that is still a massive amount of your life spent just sitting in transit.
It absolutely sounds exhausting to an outside observer. But when the sociologists actually sat down and conducted qualitative interviews with these daily commuters, they revealed something incredibly surprising. These people completely reject the idea that their commute is dead time. They actively treat the train carriage as a psychological decompression chamber.
A decompression chamber.
Think about the alternatives. Think about driving a car in brutal stop-and-go rush hour traffic. It's highly stressful. You're gripping the wheel. You're angry at other drivers. You have to be constantly alert. Or think about taking a traditional packed subway. It's incredibly crowded, it's noisy, you've got someone's elbow jammed into your ribs.
Pure misery.
Exactly. But a reserved plush seat on a modern high-speed train, it is perfectly quiet, the ride is buttery smooth, you have your own space, a tray table, climate control. Many of these supercommuters explicitly use that 30 or 40 minutes of transit to sleep, to read a novel, or simply to mentally transition. They use the speed and the peace to psychologically shed the stressful skin of the corporate employee.
So that by the time they step off the platform in Suzhou, they aren't bringing the office stress home. They are fully mentally prepared to just be a present parent or a supportive partner.
It's a managed transition. Then moving along the spectrum, you have the weekly commuter. The researchers call them the pendulum.
The pendulum.
Exactly. This group is much more like Zhao. They might rent a tiny, cheap, bare-bones room in the expensive megacity for Monday through Thursday. They treat that room purely as a place to sleep and shower while they hyper-focus on their career. But their real, authentic life, their family, their friends, their social standing, happens back in their hometown on the weekends. And what's fascinating is that this specific group is very often using the train to expertly navigate the massive complexities of the hukou system.
Ah, the hukou system, the household registration system. Honestly, this is the massive elephant in the room whenever we talk about labor mobility and demographics in China.
For anyone unfamiliar, your hukou is basically your internal domestic passport. Your legal access to vital social services, things like subsidized public health care, the right to buy a home, and crucially, the right to enroll your children in public schools, is strictly tied to your official registered place of residence.
Right. So you could land an incredibly high-paying tech job in Shanghai, but if your hukou is still registered in a smaller, poorer city miles away, you cannot just easily move your spouse and kids to Shanghai with you.
If you bring your kids to Shanghai without a local hukou, they simply will not be allowed to attend the regular public schools. You'd have to pay exorbitant fees for private international schools, which most people can't afford.
So the train essentially becomes a massive technological workaround for a rigid bureaucratic rule. The government policy says you legally cannot move your family to this city, so the citizen uses the high-speed technology to say, fine, then I'll just use the train to move myself back to my family every weekend.
The technology is moving vastly faster than the bureaucracy can adapt. The high-speed rail network acts as a crucial societal pressure valve. It actively releases the massive social friction caused by the outdated hukou system. It allows ambitious individuals to fully participate in and benefit from the booming urban economy without being forced to abandon the critical social safety net of their home region.
I want to circle back to something you mentioned a minute ago about competence and cognitive appropriation, because there was one specific tiny detail in the qualitative research that I absolutely love reading about. It was the Door 11 hack.
I was hoping you'd bring that up. It is the absolute perfect ground-level example of cognitive appropriation in action.
Explain it to me, because on the surface, a train door is just a train door.
Not to a veteran, high-motility supercommuter. The researchers spent time observing these people, and they found that these commuters haven't just memorized the train schedules. They have intricately memorized the exact physical architectural layouts of both their origin and destination stations.
Down to the centimeter.
They know for a fact that when they pull into the massive Shanghai Hankow station at 8:00 a.m., the specific escalator that leads most directly down to the crucial subway transfer line perfectly aligns with train carriage number 11, door B.
So they aren't just casually strolling onto the platform and standing anywhere to wait for the train.
They are calculatingly positioning their bodies on the departure platform for maximum possible efficiency upon arrival. They know that if they're the first person out of door 11, they completely bypass the massive crowd of confused tourists and beat everyone to that specific escalator.
It's like a finely choreographed dance.
And that 60 seconds they save, it isn't trivial. That single minute might be the absolute difference between catching the 8:04 a.m. subway train or being forced to wait for the crowded 8:09 a.m. train. When you are doing this grueling commute every single day of your life, those saved minutes radically compound. It demonstrates a profound level of human mastery over the massive state infrastructure. They aren't just passively sitting in a seat meat being transported, they are actively, aggressively optimizing the system to serve their specific life goals.
It really heavily underscores the precarious balance they are trying to maintain. Listening to that, it feels like they are walking a very high, very thin tightrope. Because if the high-speed train is delayed by just 10 minutes, or if that specific escalator is broken for maintenance, their whole delicate, perfectly timed dual life structure just violently wobbles.
It is incredibly precarious. It requires an immense amount of cognitive load to manage. When asked, they universally view this exhausting tightrope act as vastly superior to the alternative. The alternative, that total social death, that complete and utter severance from their ancestral home and family, is viewed as fundamentally unacceptable. The train allows them to have their cake and eat it too, even if they have to constantly eat it while hurtling across the countryside at 300 kilometers per hour.
So we've thoroughly explored how the train radically rewires the microeconomy of a village with Lin's embroidery business. We've seen how it deeply alters the fundamental family dynamic and social fabric with Zhao's weekly commute. But for our third and final segment, I really want to pull the camera all the way back. Let's zoom out to the widest possible lens. Segment 3, the global blueprint. Because the reality is, what China has managed to physically build over the last 15 years is entirely unprecedented in the history of human engineering.
The sheer raw scale of it is almost impossible for the human brain to properly comprehend. We are talking about over 25,000 kilometers of dedicated, purpose-built, high-speed passenger lines.
Just to give our listeners some context, that is more high-speed rail than the entire rest of the world combined.
Exactly.
And to really anchor this massive macro achievement, we have one final story from the sources. We have the story of Alim. Alim is a young university student, and he hails from the far western frontier region of the country.
The frontier. That specific word carries so much heavy historical baggage. If we go right back to those grim Qing Dynasty records you brought up at the very start of the deep dive, the frontier was exactly what they called the Great Northern Wilderness, or the desolate Far West.
It was the ultimate destination for the exiles.
Right. It was the place where the state deliberately sent broken people to be completely forgotten by history. For centuries, the entire region was institutionally branded as a barren wasteland.
So geographical isolation, there wasn't just a frustrating logistical problem about moving goods. It was a deep, pervasive social stigma. The implicit message was, if you were born out there, you were inherently separate from and lesser than the civilized economic core of the eastern seaboard.
Exactly. And Alim's personal journey violently represents the total death of that ancient stigma. He managed to secure a spot at a prestigious top-tier university all the way in the prosperous East. Now, before the high-speed rail network expanded westward, attempting that journey was a literal odyssey.
How bad was it?
We are talking about spending multiple days on what they call the greenskin trains.
The old, slow...
Right. Unair-conditioned, incredibly slow, mind-numbingly crowded trains that stopped at every single dirt road village. Or the only other option was buying a commercial airline flight, which for a rural farming family would literally cost an entire year's worth of disposable income. It was economically impossible.
So the sheer friction of the distance was essentially a giant wall telling him, you don't truly belong over here.
Correct. But the aggressive, deliberate expansion of the high-speed network deep into these historical frontier regions is a massive political statement just as much as it is an economic strategy. By intentionally shattering that geographical isolation, the state is loudly declaring that every single corner of the nation is equally accessible and inherently valuable. It effectively takes these historically disconnected, isolated islands and forcibly stitches them together into a single, cohesive, breathing national organism.
Okay, the philosophy of that is powerful. But I want to talk strictly about the physical mechanics of this miracle. How on earth did they physically manage to build so much track so incredibly fast? Because I look at major infrastructure projects in the US or in the UK like HS2, and they take literally decades.
Decades of arguing.
Exactly. There are endless environmental reviews, vicious budget fights, local zoning lawsuits, massive cost overruns. But China just seemed to snap its fingers and pave a continent. How?
Well, I can assure you it wasn't magic, and they didn't cut corners on the physics of it. It was a very specific, ruthless strategy of execution. The World Bank report we reviewed explicitly credits something called the Medium and Long-Term Railway Plan. The central government set a rigid, highly detailed 15-year vision, and then they relentlessly executed it through their rolling 5-year plans.
So it was just raw consistency.
Consistency was the foundation. They completely insulated the project project from political whiplash. They didn't radically alter the route map or slash the funding every time a new local mayor took office.
Okay, political consistency is great, but that still doesn't explain how the guys in the hard hats actually poured the concrete that fast on the ground.
Right. The true secret sauce on the ground is extreme standardization. Key. When you critically look at high-speed rail construction in other developed countries, almost every single bridge is treated like a unique, bespoke architectural project. Every tunnel is framed as a brand new engineering marvel.
Right. They hire a famous architect, they design something beautiful and unique for that specific valley.
Exactly. But in China, they looked at that and said, no. They took the incredibly complex process of bridge building and turned it into a boring, repetitive factory assembly line.
How do you turn a bridge into an assembly line?
They utilized these massive, universally standardized concrete box girders. They literally build a temporary, highly efficient concrete casting factory right in the dirt directly next to the planned rail line. They cast these identical concrete blocks, and then they bring in this machine, a colossal custom-built bridge launching machine.
A bridge launching machine. That sounds like a sci-fi weapon.
It slowly crawls along the freshly built bridge piers, picks up a massive precast concrete block, slides forward, and carefully drops it perfectly into place. Then it rolls forward onto the block it just placed and repeats the process, one after another. They aren't artisanally crafting a bridge. They are rapidly assembling a giant, standardized concrete Lego set.
And I have to assume that aggressively drives the construction costs down.
Massively. The World Bank data strictly shows that construction costs in China average out to about 17 to 21 million US dollars per kilometer of track.
Okay, $17 million for 1 kilometer still sounds like an astronomical amount of money to me. Is that actually considered low?
In the highly specialized world of high-speed rail, that is an absolute bargain. It is basement pricing. If you look at similar projects in Europe or the US, those exact same costs wildly spiral to 50 million, 100 million, or sometimes even more per kilometer.
Because of the bespoke designs and the endless land acquisition lawsuits.
China is systematically building a superior network at 2/3 the cost, or even less, of what Western nations are paying.
But let's bring it all the way back to the white elephant skepticism we started with. Even if it is vastly cheaper to physically build, these trains require massive amounts of electricity and maintenance to run safely every single day. Are average people actually riding these trains out in the poorer Western provinces? Or are we looking at fleets of pristine ghost trains running empty just to keep the schedule?
That is exactly where the phenomenon of the network effect explosively kicks in. In the very early days of the build-out, vocal critics absolutely pointed to half-empty trains on brand new isolated lines and loudly cried failure. But as the network grew and violently connected more and more distinct cities, the ridership didn't just grow linearly, it surged exponentially.
Because suddenly you can go everywhere, not just point A to point B.
Exactly. It's exactly like a telephone network. Owning the only telephone in the world is completely useless. Owning one of 2 telephones is okay. But when 1 billion people have a telephone, it instantly becomes an essential utility for human survival. And crucially, because their standardized construction costs were kept remarkably low, the state operator can afford to keep the actual passenger fares incredibly competitive.
How competitive are we talking? Give me a baseline.
The ticket prices are roughly 1/4 the base fares you would pay for an equivalent high-speed journey in Europe or Japan.
A quarter of the price.
Yes. And that specific pricing strategy changes everything. If a train ticket costs $200, it fundamentally remains a niche luxury product for wealthy business elites. But if that exact same ticket strictly costs $40, it instantly becomes mass public transit for the working class. That pricing is exactly why the system successfully handles an absolutely staggering 1.7 billion passenger trips every single year.
1.7 billion. You literally can't even picture a number that big.
And because of that massive, relentless volume of human movement, the system reliably creates that powerful economic mass we dissected earlier. The World Bank explicitly estimates the overall economic rate of return for the Chinese rail network at roughly 8%.
8%.
Right. And that 8% return is actually higher than the baseline opportunity cost of capital in China and higher than in most other developing nations.
Okay, so that essentially completely debunks the white elephant myth entirely.
Because when you zoom out and strictly evaluate the system as a holistic national organism, it definitively pays for itself. Maybe not immediately in cold, hard cash at the station fare box tracks every single day for every single remote rural line, but absolutely in the massive aggregate economic and social lift it consistently provides to the entire nation.
Which perfectly brings us to what the outline explicitly calls the ALEEM model. We noted earlier that top urban planners and government officials from across Africa and Southeast Asia are currently intensely studying this exact rollout. Why?
Because they look at their own maps and they see the exact same crippling foundational problem. They suffer from severe geographical isolation. They often have massive, incredibly valuable raw resources completely trapped in their rugged interiors, and they have booming export ports on the coast. But they simply cannot connect the two efficiently. They have brilliant, hungry talent trapped in remote farming villages that physically cannot reach the modern universities in the capital cities.
So they aren't just looking at the Chinese high-speed rail as a cool, fast train. They view it as a proven, heavy-duty tool for engineered social equity.
Exactly. It represents a massive leapfrog technology for them.
Leapfrog technology, like skipping landlines and going straight to cell phones.
Just as dozens of developing nations completely skipped the arduous, expensive phase of stringing up millions of copper telephone wires and jumped straight to building cellular towers, these developing nations are actively looking at skipping the incredibly destructive, highly inefficient American model of car-centric, massive concrete highways. They want to leapfrog straight into electrified, mass transit, high-speed rail.
And for someone specific like Alum, the student from the far west, this infrastructure completely radically changes the entire trajectory of his life. It fundamentally shifts the regional dynamic from brain drain to brain circulation.
That is a vital concept to grasp.
Yeah, let's make sure we define that clearly. Because traditional brain drain is when the absolute smartest kid in the remote village studies hard, leaves for the big wealthy city, and then entirely severs ties and never looks back, largely because physically going back is just too exhausting and difficult.
Exactly. The village permanently loses its best mind. But brain circulation is the new reality that high-speed rail actively enables. Because the travel friction is completely destroyed, Alim can comfortably go study at a top-tier university in Beijing. He can actively build an incredible high-level professional network, but he can seamlessly and easily return to his Western home region to start a tech business, or actively consult for local government, or even just visit to spend money and share ideas. The prohibitive physical barrier to return is completely lowered.
He doesn't have to permanently amputate the limb just to save the body.
He can inhabit both spaces.
It is a genuinely incredibly powerful idea, deliberately connecting the forgotten periphery directly to the wealthy core, but without inherently destroying or draining the periphery in the process.
That is the ultimate, incredibly difficult goal of modern statecraft.
Well, we have covered an absolutely massive amount of conceptual ground today. We started deep in the grim historical archives, looking at the Qing dynasty, literally tattooing the faces of desperate exiles. And we've marched all the way to analyzing the incredibly sophisticated, hyper-optimized daily habits of tech commuters in the modern Yangtze Delta.
It really heavily reinforces the core idea that while we always tend to talk about massive infrastructure purely as hardware, we talk about the tons of forged steel, the cubic meters of poured concrete, the megawatts of electricity. True, lasting impact is actually entirely as software. Yes, a project of this magnitude actively rewrites the foundational operating system of the entire society.
So let's try to neatly synthesize everything we've uncovered today. We essentially have three main load-bearing pillars to this narrative. First, we explored the massive economic catalyst, which was perfectly represented by Lin in Guizhou. The high-speed train literally violently transformed her sheer mountains from a historical cage into a modern, frictionless gateway. It actively allowed for rapid agglomeration, instantly plugging her tiny, isolated village economy directly into the massive, high-voltage power grid of the national economy.
But importantly, as we discussed, not without severe risks. We actively acknowledge the dangerous siphoning effect. The train acts as an unfeeling amplifier. It massively helps those who have something highly unique to sell, but it can utterly drain those who don't. That reality strictly requires incredibly smart, highly tailored regional policy to ensure the train doesn't just accidentally manufacture a totally new, even faster kind of inequality.
Absolutely. Then second, we dove deep into the concept of social cohesion, which was brought to life by Zhao. The train essentially acts as an engine for social resurrection. It elegantly solves the massive, tragic, floating population crisis by granting people true motility.
Right, that crucial capacity and freedom to move.
It actively allows them to fiercely maintain their relational self, fulfilling their deep traditional duties to their aging parents and their ancestors, while simultaneously and vigorously participating in the hyper-competitive modern urban tech workforce.
It beautifully practically resolves the massive historical tension between the ambitions of the modern individual and the heavy obligations of the traditional collective. It allows both of those conflicting identities to peacefully coexist within the exact same person.
And finally, third, we outline the global blueprint, represented by Alim. The sweeping expansion of the train network completely systematically destroys the ancient toxic stigma of the frontier. It definitively proves that with intense standardization and absolutely relentless long-term planning, a determined nation can literally use concrete and engineering to overpower geography itself. It offers a tangible, working model that loudly declares the exact coordinates of where you are born do not inherently have to dictate the limits of where you end up.
And crucially, it completely proves that this can actually be done at a financial cost and a speed that makes it a highly viable, realistic model for the rest of the rapidly developing world to legally copy.
It really fundamentally forces you to completely rethink the very definition of economic value. If a specific rail line technically loses a little bit of money on a sterile accountant's spreadsheet, but that exact same rail line actively saves an ancient, beautiful regional culture from total fragmentation and death, is it actually a loss?
That is arguably the defining public policy question of this century. Traditional economics usually completely fails to accurately price in totally intangible assets like human dignity or the deep psychological value of family connection.
Because you can't put a dollar amount on seeing your mother.
Exactly. But those specific, unquantifiable things are the exact hidden mortar that actually makes a society stable and resilient. China seems to have confidently decided that the ultimate hidden cost of not building this network, the brutal, incalculable cost of managing a deeply fractured, heavily isolated, resentful population, was vastly, infinitely higher than the sheer upfront cost of the steel and the concrete.
That is an incredibly powerful takeaway. We started this deep dive with the grim, striking image of Liu Fang, the ancient punishment of forced exile. For thousands of years of recorded human history, geography was essentially destiny. It was a cold, unfeeling dictator that rigidly decided exactly who you could be, entirely based on the arbitrary location where you happened to be born. If you were born trapped in the deep mountains, you lived and you died trapped in the mountains. We are currently witnessing what might be the very first era in human history where a modern nation has actively, deliberately attempted to systematically overthrow that geographic dictator through the sheer force of civil engineering. It strongly suggests that the ultimate true goal of this massive infrastructure project isn't really just about physically moving human bodies across the map at 350 kilometers per hour. It is profoundly about expanding the diameter of the human heart, finally allowing it to firmly hold on to the deep roots of home, while still aggressively grasping the endless possibilities of the future.
Beautifully summarized. It is fundamentally about forging deep, lasting human connection in its absolute truest, most literal sense.
Hopefully, the very next time you see a set of train tracks stretching toward the horizon, you'll see something much more profound than just wood and steel. Until next time.